Welcome back. Wherever you are and whatever kind of day you've had, now is the time to let it all go. Settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we take another quiet dive into history. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be. Just listen, breathe, and let the story carry you gently toward rest. Tonight, we'll follow the slow, winding path of those who once chased dreams of gold. Long before there were cities or railways, there were footsteps, tired, hopeful, and determined, carving their way through dust, forest, and mountain. This is the quiet story of the road to the gold mines, not just of what they found, but of what they left behind. Part 1: Preparations and Departure. Chapter 1: The Lure and the Tedium, a sober look at the gold rush. The middle of the 19th century, a whisper, then a murmur, then a clamor. Gold, discovered in the far-off sun-baked lands of California, or so the broadsheets, increasingly dog-eared and passed from hand to hand, proclaimed. This news, carried on the slow currents of human communication, began to agitate the settled, predictable rhythms of life in the eastern states, and indeed across the wider world. For many, the word gold conjured visions of immediate, effortless wealth, a glittering panacea for lives often characterized by toil and modest reward. The phrase gold rush itself suggests a sudden, energetic, almost joyful surge of humanity towards a common, shining goal. However, the reality, as is so often the case with such grand, sweeping narratives, was a far more granular and frequently a far more wearisome affair. For every fantastical tale of a nugget the size of a man's fist, there were uncounted, unrecorded days of backbreaking labor under a relentless sun, of dwindling supplies, of hopes slowly eroding like soft sandstone under a persistent, indifferent wind. The rush was less a sprint and more an arduous, protracted migration, a slow, deliberate uprooting driven not always by adventurous spirit, but often by a quiet desperation, a calculated gamble against the familiar hardships of an existing life. And for those who possessed the means, or could gather them through the sale of nearly all they owned, the journey westward towards these uncertain Californian promises frequently began not on a swift steed or with a light heart, but within the cramped, jolting confines of a public stagecoach. This mode of transport, a utilitarian marvel of wood, leather, and iron, represented one of the primary, if profoundly uncomfortable, arteries connecting the established East with the burgeoning, chaotic West. It was not a conveyance of leisure, nor one designed for the pleasant contemplation of passing landscapes. Rather, it was a crucible, a test of endurance before the true tests of the goldfields even began. The very idea of rushing in such a vehicle was a cruel misnomer. The pace was dictated by the stamina of horses, the condition of rudimentary roads, and the unyielding schedule of the stage line. The journey, therefore, that we are to contemplate is not one of thrilling encounters or daring escapades. It is, instead, a journey of routine discomfort, of endless, jarring motion, of dust that settled upon everything, coating the tongue, inflaming the eyes, and embedding itself into the very fabric of one's clothing and spirit. It is a journey measured in the monotonous turning of heavy wheels, the rhythmic creak of strained leather thoroughbraces, and the weary sighs of fellow passengers, each nursing their own private anxieties and the dull ache of compressed limbs. We shall set aside the gilded myths and delve into the prosaic the exhausting, the deeply unromantic reality of overland stage travel in the year of our Lord, 1852, as individuals, propelled by a distant, flickering hope, embarked upon the interminable trail towards the California goldfields. The anticipation, if any, was not for adventure, but for the eventual longed for cessation of the journey itself. Chapter 2: The Severance and the Selection, Assembling the Meager Remnants for a New Life. The decision once made, or perhaps more accurately, once succumbed to, initiated a period of profound, if undramatic, upheaval. To undertake such a voyage was to sever ties, not with a swift, clean cut, but with the slow, deliberate dismantling of a life. Consider for a moment the contents of a modest eastern farmstead, or a small town artisan's workshop in the year 1852. Each possession, however humble, represented an investment of labor, of meager savings, or perhaps an inheritance from a previous generation. The intending traveler, now committed to the uncertain path west, would begin the somber process of liquidation. There was, for instance, the old, somewhat rusted, single-furrow walking plow, its wooden handles worn smooth and dark by years of calloused hands, the iron share dulled from countless stubborn encounters with the familiar earth of the now soon-to-be abandoned eastern farm. That would be sold, perhaps for a few dollars, to a neighbor less inclined to chase distant fortunes. Then the livestock, a pair of stoic dairy cows, their milk a daily staple, their gentle lowing a familiar sound in the early morning mist. They too would be led away by a new owner, their value assessed with a practical, unsentimental eye. The sturdy workhorse, perhaps, if not deemed essential for the initial leg of a much longer, multi-stage journey, would also be sold, its patient strength converted into a small pile of currency. Tools of a trade. The carpenter's set of hand-forged chisels, each with its own specific heft and balance. The blacksmith's heavy anvil and an assortment of hammers, their surfaces bearing the honorable scars of countless shaping blows. The cobbler's collection of awls, knives, and lasts. All these implements of daily labor, of identity even, would be carefully appraised, and more often than not, relinquished. Household furnishings, painstakingly acquired or inherited. The oaken dining table, witness to countless family meals. The sturdy unadorned bedsteads. The heavy quilts, stitched through long winter evenings. The collection of pewter or simple ceramic tableware. These too would be sold, or if time grew short, simply left behind, silent monuments to a departed existence. Each transaction, each farewell to a familiar object, was a small, unceremonious subtraction from a known world, a slow effacement of a previous self. What, then, was to be taken? The constraints were severe. Stagecoach companies, driven by the practical limitations of horse-drawn transport and the desire to maximize paying human cargo, imposed strict limits on personal baggage. Every pound was accounted for, every cubic inch a matter of commercial consideration. The prudent traveler therefore selected with ruthless economy. A change of sturdy clothing, or perhaps two, woolen trousers, durable against wear and indifferent to dirt, a pair of flannel shirts, offering some protection against both sun and chill, thick knitted stockings, several pairs. For feet were to endure much. A heavy coat or a thick blanket was essential, for the nights on the plains or in the mountains could be unexpectedly, bitingly cold, even after days of searing heat. Personal items were few, perhaps a Bible, its cover worn, its pages softened by use, a straight razor, and a small, cracked mirror for the rudimentary performance of toilette, a tin cup and plate for the unappetizing fare to be consumed at way stations. For those who could write, a small diary and a stub of pencil to record, perhaps, the endless monotony of the days, or the escalating prices of basic commodities. Any tools deemed essential for the prospective gold fields, a pickaxe head, a shovel blade, handles to be fashioned later, a gold pan. These added significant weight and were subject to intense scrutiny and often additional charges. All these meager possessions would be packed into a durable canvas sack, a small reinforced wooden chest, or a leather valise, each container chosen more for its resilience than for its elegance. The very act of packing this diminished collection of worldly goods was a tangible symbol of the reduced, uncertain future that lay ahead, a stark contrast to the expansive, often exaggerated promises of California. The weight of these few items was nothing compared to the unseen burden of anxieties and the faint flickering ember of hope that each traveler carried within. Chapter 3: The Toll of Passage, Bureaucracy, Cost, and the Fine Print of Hope. Having reduced one's worldly existence to a manageable, if pitiable, bundle, the next ritual in this slow pilgrimage was the acquisition of a ticket. This was not a casual transaction. The offices of the major stage lines, names like Adams and Company or Wells Fargo, already beginning to etch themselves into the lexicon of westward expansion, were often bustling, somewhat disorganized places, typically housed in unpretentious buildings in the commercial districts of larger towns or cities that served as departure hubs. Inside, one might find a long, polished wooden counter, behind which a clerk, or perhaps several, attended to a persistent queue of prospective travelers. The air would be thick with the murmur of low conversations, the scuffing of boots on wooden floors, and the pervasive, slightly stale odor of ink, paper, and unventilated human congregation. The process was invariably slow. Each transaction required the careful inscription of names in a ledger, the counting and recounting of currency, and often a tedious recitation of the company's terms and conditions. The cost of passage was a significant barrier. A ticket for the overland journey to California in 1852 could range from $200 to $300, sometimes even more, depending on the route, the season, and the perceived level of urgency or desperation of the purchaser. To put this sum into perspective, a skilled laborer in the eastern states might earn $1 or perhaps $1.50 for a full day's work, typically lasting 10 to 12 hours. A farmhand might earn considerably less. The ticket price, therefore, could represent a year's wages or more for an ordinary individual. It was a sum not lightly expended, often representing the entirety of the proceeds from the sale of a farm, a business, or a lifetime of accumulated small savings. This financial commitment, made in cramped and dusty offices, was a profound act of faith, or perhaps a monumental gamble on an unseen future. The ticket itself, a slip of printed paper, often adorned with the company's florid logo, was more than just a pass. It was a contract, the one heavily weighted in favor of the carrier. Buried within the small, densely packed print were clauses that few passengers likely read with care, or if they did, had little power to contest. These stipulations would invariably limit the company's liability for lost or damaged baggage, a frequent occurrence on the rough and tumble trails. They would absolve the company of responsibility for delays, which were not so much a possibility as a certainty, caused by weather, mechanical failure, road conditions, or the simple, unpredictable availability of fresh horses. Rules of conduct for passengers were also often implied, if not explicitly stated. These were unwritten laws of cramped coexistence, an expectation of stoicism in the face of discomfort, a tacit agreement not to complain unduly about the quality of the food or the roughness of the ride, and a general forbearance towards the unavoidable intrusions of fellow travelers in the shared, confined space. Some lines might offer, or claim to offer, different classes of service, but in the context of a Concord stagecoach bumping its way over rutted tracks, such distinctions were largely illusory. Perhaps a first-class ticket entitled one to a slightly less worn section of the hard bench, or a marginally greater theoretical claim on the already insufficient legroom. In practice, all passengers, regardless of the premium paid, were subject to the same democratic leveling of dust, jolts, and general misery. The purchase of the ticket, then, was the sealing of a pact, an entry into a temporary mobile society governed by the immutable laws of discomfort and the slow, relentless tyranny of distance. It was the price of hope, paid in advance, with no guarantee of a satisfactory return. Chapter 4. The Hour of Commotion, the Station, the Coach, and the Cramped Commencement. The day of departure was seldom an occasion of serene farewells or dignified embarkation. The stagecoach stations, particularly those in major feeder towns like St. Joseph or Independence, Missouri, were typically scenes of organized yet palpable chaos. The air, from before dawn, would be thick with a cacophony of sounds. The impatient snorting and stamping of harnessed horses, their breath pluming in the cool morning air. The sharp, authoritative cries of hostlers and drivers, their voices cutting through the general din. The rumble of heavy, iron-shod wheels on packed earth or cobblestone, and the confused murmur of passengers, porters, and onlookers. The smells were equally potent and unromantic. The pervasive, earthy aroma of horses and their inevitable manure, the dry, choking scent of dust, stirred into constant motion by hooves and feet. The faint, lingering smell of wood smoke from nearby cook fires or the station office stove, and occasionally the acrid tang of cheap tobacco. Passengers, clutching their meager belongings, would navigate this scene of purposeful disorder, seeking out the company agent to confirm their passage and to submit their baggage to the final, often arbitrary, scrutiny. The process of stowing luggage was a feat of spatial engineering and brute force. The rear boot of the stagecoach, a large leather or canvas-covered compartment, would be packed solid with trunks, chests, and valises, each item jostling for precious space. Heavier items were often strapped to the roof, covered with a tarpaulin, and exposed to the full onslaught of sun, rain, and yet more dust. The weight of each passenger's allotment was notionally limited, perhaps to 25 or 30 pounds, but enforcement could be inconsistent. Excess baggage, if permitted at all, incurred steep additional fees, another small drain on dwindling resources. And then there was the coach itself. The Concord stagecoach, a design perfected in New England, was the workhorse of the overland routes. It was a robust, if ungainly, vehicle. Its curved body, typically painted in a durable, conspicuous color like deep red or somber green, with perhaps the stage line's name and route emblazoned in contrasting lettering, was suspended not on metal springs, but on thick leather straps called thoroughbraces. These were intended to absorb the shocks of the uneven road, but in practice, they imparted a unique, rolling, pitching motion that was a primary contributor to passenger discomfort and, for many, to motion sickness. The wheels were tall and sturdy, with wooden spokes and iron rims, designed for durability rather than a smooth ride. The interior of the coach was a study in compressed intimacy. Typically, it was designed to seat 9 passengers inside on 3 unforgiving benches. The front bench faced backward, the rear bench faced forward, and the middle bench, often a simple plank with a leather strap for a backrest, or no backrest at all, was suspended between the doors, forcing its occupants to sit with their knees interlocked with those opposite. There was no concept of personal space. Passengers were packed shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip. Windows, if they could be called that, were often mere openings covered by leather or canvas curtains, offering little protection from dust, rain, or the prying eyes of the curious, and certainly no clear view of the passing scenery. The signal for boarding would be given, and a slow, awkward scramble would ensue. There was no graceful way to enter the high-slung body of the coach. Passengers would hoist themselves up, often with the assistance of a small, rickety step or a helping hand, and then maneuver themselves into the dim, cramped interior. The best seats, by the curtained openings, were quickly claimed, though their advantages were debatable. The air inside would already be close, tinged with the odors of leather, old wood, and the collective anxieties of its occupants. Once all 9 souls were wedged inside, and perhaps several more adventurous or less affluent individuals had secured passage on the roof amongst the baggage and mail sacks, the driver would crack his long whip. The horses would lunge forward, and with a groan of strained wood and leather, the great, lumbering vehicle would begin its slow, arduous, and profoundly uncomfortable journey westward. The first of many thousands of jolts would be felt, a jarring promise of the days and weeks of relentless motion to come. The endless trail had begun. Part 2, The Road, Stage 1, Plains and Initial Hardships. Chapter 5, The First Day, Jolts, Dust, and Monotonous Landscape. The commencement of the journey was not marked by any gentle easing into motion. Rather, it was a sudden, violent lurch as the driver, perched high on his box, unleashed a sharp crack of his long whip and a guttural command to the team of 4, or often 6, horses. The animals, anticipating the demand, strained against their harnesses, and the great, unwieldy bulk of the Concorde coach shuddered, groaned, and then, with a series of jarring jerks, began its ponderous progress. For the 9 souls compressed within its dim interior, and for those perhaps clinging precariously to the roof, this initial surge was a stark introduction to the physical realities that would define their existence for many weeks to come. The motion of the stagecoach, suspended as it was on those thick leather thoroughbraces, was a complex and deeply unsettling affair. It was not merely a forward progression, but a relentless combination of pitching, rolling, and side-to-side swaying, punctuated by sharp, unpredictable jolts as the iron-rimmed wheels encountered rocks, ruts, or fallen branches, concealed by the ever-present dust. Each passenger became intimately and uncomfortably aware of the contours of their seat, a hard, unyielding bench, often thinly padded with worn leather or coarse fabric, if padded at all. The body, seeking some form of stability, was constantly tensed, yet inevitably, heads would collide with the wooden framework, shoulders would bump against neighbors, and knees would be knocked with bruising regularity. And then there was the dust. It began as a faint haze, stirred by the hooves of the lead horses and the turning of the front wheels. But as the coach gained momentum and the day wore on, it became a pervasive, suffocating presence. Fine particles of desiccated earth, pulverized by countless previous passages, rose in billowing clouds, a persistent ochre or gray plume that enveloped the vehicle. It seeped through every crack and crevice, through the imperfectly sealed leather curtains that served as windows, settling like a fine, gritty shroud upon clothing, hair, and exposed skin. It found its way into nostrils, causing a persistent dryness and irritation. It coated the tongue, imparting a constant, earthy taste that even the strongest coffee at way stations could not entirely dispel. Eyes, unshielded by any form of protective eyewear common in later eras, became red-rimmed and inflamed, smarting and watering in a futile attempt to expel the intrusive grit. To speak was to inhale it. To breathe was to resign oneself to its constant, unwelcome ingestion. The landscape for much of this first day, and indeed for many days to follow as the coach traversed the great eastern plains, offered little to distract from the internal miseries of the conveyance. Through the narrow dust-streaked openings, or when a curtain was momentarily drawn aside for a breath of marginally less dusty air, the view was one of almost unvarying monotony. Vast expanses of prairie grasses, perhaps still green in the earlier part of the season, or already cured to a uniform, pale tan by the summer sun, stretched to a distant, unwavering horizon. The undulations of the land were gentle, almost imperceptible, offering no dramatic vistas, no sudden revelations of scenic beauty. An occasional stunted tree or a small meandering creek, its banks perhaps marked by a denser growth of willows, might offer a fleeting moment of visual variation. But such landmarks were few and far between. The sun, a relentless brassy disk in a pale sky, climbed slowly to its zenith, beat down upon the canvas roof of the coach, and then, with equal deliberation, began its descent towards the western rim of the world. Time itself seemed to stretch, measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the aching of muscles, the growing film of grime, and the slow, almost imperceptible shift in the angle of the shadows cast by the laboring coach. The primary sounds were the rhythmic, dull thud of hooves on the packed earth, the continuous, multifaceted creaking of the wooden coach body and its leather suspension, the occasional shouted encouragement or curse from the driver to his team, and the low, weary sighs or involuntary groans from the passengers within. Chapter 6, the first stop, home station, food and rest of dubious quality. After several hours of this relentless, bone-jarring progress, a period of time that invariably felt far longer than its actual duration, the driver might rein in his team, and the coach would gradually slow, its cacophony of creaks and groans subsiding into a series of lesser shudders as it came to a halt. This would typically occur at a designated home station or swing station. The distinction was often nominal to the passengers. though home stations were generally slightly larger establishments where drivers might be changed and where a rudimentary meal was usually available. Swing stations were often little more than a corral and perhaps a very basic shelter, existing solely for the purpose of providing a fresh team of horses. The relief at the cessation of motion, however temporary, was palpable. Passengers would extricate themselves slowly and stiffly from the cramped confines of the coach, their limbs aching, their joints protesting. Stepping onto solid ground, even if that ground was merely the dusty, manure strewn yard of the station, felt like a profound liberation. There would be a collective stretching of backs, a rubbing of sore knees, a shaking of dust from hats and coats. A typical home station was not an oasis of comfort. It was, more often than not, a primitive structure, perhaps built of rough-hewn logs if timber was available, or of sun-dried adobe bricks, or even sod in the more treeless regions of the plains. A low, sagging roof, often of packed earth or rough shingles, offered scant protection from the elements. Inside, the main room would be dim, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, stale food, unwashed bodies, and often the sharp tang of lye soap used for rudimentary cleaning. Furnishings were sparse and utilitarian. A long, rough-hewn plank table, or several smaller, equally crude ones, surrounded by backless benches or simple stools. The floor would be of packed earth or rough, uneven wooden planks, invariably coated with a layer of dirt tracked in from outside. The primary activity at such a station, apart from the passenger's brief respite, was the changing of the horse team. Hostlers, often lean, weathered men whose lives revolved around the endless cycle of arriving and departing stages, would move with practiced, if unhurried, efficiency. The tired horses, their flanks dark with sweat and caked with dust, their heads drooping with fatigue, would be unharnessed and led away to a trough of often murky water and a meager offering of hay or oats. A fresh team, hopefully more rested, though often just as lean, would be brought from the corral, their eyes sometimes showing a spark of resistance before they too were subjected to the familiar weight and chafe of the heavy leather harnesses. The entire process, from the unbuckling of traces to the final tightening of straps on the new team, might take anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes, a period of enforced idleness for the waiting passengers. For those who desired it and possessed the necessary coin, food was available. The quality and variety, however, were seldom subjects of praise. The staple fare at most stage stations consisted of salt pork, fried to a leathery toughness, or perhaps a stew of indeterminate origin, thickened with flour. Beans, cooked until soft and often refried, were a common accompaniment. Bread, if available, was typically a heavy, dense cornbread or hard, dry biscuits, colloquially known as hardtack, capable of challenging the strongest teeth. Coffee, brewed in large, battered tin pots, was usually strong, black, and bitter, often extended with roasted chicory or even burnt grain to stretch the supply of actual coffee beans. It was served in thick, handleless tin cups, often still warm from a previous user or a cursory rinse. Water, drawn from a nearby well or creek, was of variable quality, sometimes clear and cool, but often brackish, lukewarm, or carrying a distinct taste of minerals or earth. The cost of such a meal, though modest by later standards, could seem exorbitant to a traveler carefully husbanding resources for the uncertainties ahead. Flies, drawn by the smells of food and livestock, were a constant buzzing annoyance, settling with democratic impartiality on both the provisions and the consumers. The meal was consumed quickly, without ceremony, driven more by the non emptiness in the stomach than by any expectation of culinary pleasure. Chapter 7: Night on the Road Attempts to Sleep in Motion. As dusk began to settle, casting long, indistinct shadows across the monotonous landscape, a decision would have been made by the stage line or the driver, whether to press on through the darkness or to halt for a few hours of rest at a designated station. Traveling through the night was faster, adhering more closely to the demanding schedules often advertised by the stage companies, particularly if mail contracts were involved. However, it significantly amplified the discomfort and the potential dangers of the journey. If the decision was to continue, the experience within the coach transformed into a different kind of ordeal. The dim light of the departing day would fade entirely, plunging the interior into an almost palpable blackness, broken only if a passenger dared to strike a precious lucifer match to briefly illuminate a watch face, or if the moon was exceptionally bright and its pale light managed to filter through a gap in the curtains. The sounds of the night, the intensified creaking of the coach, the rhythmic beat of the hooves, the driver's occasional low calls to his team, the distant howl of a coyote, or the chirping of unseen insects seemed to become more distinct, more intrusive in the absence of visual distraction. The chill of the night air would begin to seep into the coach, and passengers would huddle deeper into their coats or blankets, if they were fortunate enough to possess them. Attempting to sleep under such conditions was a frustrating, often futile exercise. There was no position that offered genuine rest. Heads would loll uncomfortably, jerking upright with each major bump in the road. Bodies would slump against neighbors, leading to awkward, involuntary encroachments on already minimal personal space. Some might try to wedge themselves into a corner, seeking a modicum of stability, only to find their bones pressed painfully against the hard wooden frame of the coach. Others might attempt to rest their heads on their baggage if it was small enough to have been brought inside, creating a lumpy, unyielding pillow. The constant motion, the unpredictable jolts, the cramped limbs, and the general miasma of discomfort conspired to keep even the most exhausted traveler suspended in a state of drowsy misery, drifting in and out of a shallow, unrefreshing doze, punctuated by moments of jarring wakefulness. Dreams, if they came, were often as restless and disjointed as the journey itself. If, on the other hand, the stage halted for a few hours at a station designated for overnight stops, the prospect of sleep was only marginally improved. Such stations might offer a common room separate from the eating area where passengers could attempt to find repose. Beds, in the conventional sense, were a rarity. More often, there would be rough wooden bunks, perhaps tiered, covered with thin, lumpy straw-filled palliases, or simply bare boards. Alternatively, passengers might be expected to find a space on the floor, using their own blankets or coats as meager bedding. Privacy was non-existent. Men, women, and occasionally children, if any were on the coach, would share the same crowded space, the air thick with the sounds of snoring, coughing, and restless turning. Blankets provided by the station, if any, were often of dubious cleanliness, thin and offering little warmth against the drafts that invariably found their way through the poorly chinked walls or under ill-fitting doors. Vermin, fleas, lice, or worse, were not uncommon companions in such establishments. The darkness would be broken only by the faint, smoky light of a single tallow candle or a cheap oil lamp left burning low, casting flickering, unsettling shadows on the rough walls and the huddled forms of the sleepers. For many, these brief nocturnal halts offered little more than a temporary cessation of the stagecoach's motion, a chance to lie horizontally for a few hours before the unwelcome call to reboard would come, all too soon, in the cold pre-dawn gloom. Chapter 8. Fellow Travelers, a Silent Community of Sufferers. The 9 individuals confined within the stagecoach and those exposed to the elements on its roof formed a temporary and voluntary community, bound together not by shared interests or social connection, but by the commonality of their arduous journey and their collective endurance of its discomforts. Over the long days and nights, a certain familiarity, born of proximity rather than congeniality, would inevitably develop. Yet it was often a familiarity marked by reserve and a distinct lack of effusive interaction. Detailed personal histories were seldom exchanged. The focus was on the immediate, on the shared present of dust, jolts, and fatigue. One might observe the other occupants with a weary, detached curiosity. There might be a taciturn farmer, his face already leathery from years of outdoor labor, perhaps heading west in search of more fertile land or a new beginning after some unstated misfortune. Beside him, a would-be merchant or tradesman, his town clothes already showing the ill effects of the journey, perhaps carrying a small sample case of wares with which he hoped to prosper in the booming, high-priced markets of California. A younger man, his eyes perhaps still holding a faint glimmer of youthful optimism, or already clouded by the dawning realization of the journey's true nature, might be a clerk seeking a more adventurous life, or a laborer hoping to trade his shovel for a gold pan. Women were less common on these early overland stages, but when present, they often endured the hardships with a quiet fortitude that commanded a certain unspoken respect. Whether they were wives following their husbands or individuals of independent, if unspecified, purpose. Conversation, when it occurred, was typically sparse and utilitarian. Remarks about the state of the road, the quality of the last meal, the likelihood of rain, or the estimated time to the next station formed the bulk of the verbal exchange. There was little energy for philosophical discussion or witty repartee. The constant noise of the coach, the need to shout to be heard over the rumble of wheels and the creaking of timbers, discouraged extended dialogue. More often, a kind of weary silence would prevail, punctuated by sighs, involuntary grunts as the coach hit a particularly vicious bump, or the occasional half-hearted attempt to shift into a less uncomfortable position. The shared space necessitated a certain degree of unspoken etiquette. One learned to minimize sudden movements that might further inconvenience a neighbor, to offer a mumbled apology if an elbow strayed too far. The smells within the coach were an unavoidable aspect of this forced intimacy. The faint, persistent odor of unwashed bodies, for opportunities for thorough ablutions, were virtually non-existent. The lingering scent of stale food, perhaps from a morsel hoarded from a previous station, the occasional whiff of strong tobacco, if a passenger on the roof indulged and the wind carried it inwards, These were not subjects for comment, merely accepted components of the shared ordeal. There were no heroes in this company, no villains, merely a collection of human beings subjected to a prolonged period of physical stress and monotonous discomfort. They were a silent community of sufferers, each absorbed in their own private battle against fatigue, boredom, and the slow erosion of patience. A shared glance of mutual resignation after a particularly violent series of jolts, a small, almost imperceptible nod of understanding when someone coughed from the dust. These were the subtle, non-verbal communications that bound them. The journey was a great leveler, stripping away social pretenses and reducing all to the common denominator of weary, dust-covered travelers, inching their way, day by monotonous day, towards an uncertain destination. Chapter 9: Minor Breakdowns and Delays, the Routine of Roadside Annoyances. The journey westward was not only a trial of human endurance, but also a severe test of the mechanical integrity of the stagecoach and the stamina of the horses. Breakdowns and delays were not exceptional occurrences. They were an anticipated, almost routine feature of overland travel. The rough, often unmaintained roads, strewn with rocks and pitted with holes, subjected the vehicle to constant, unremitting stress. A sudden, more violent lurch than usual, accompanied perhaps by a sharp crack or a grating, metallic screech, would signal that some component had failed. The driver, his senses keenly attuned to the sound and feel of his coach and team, would react instantly, pulling hard on the reins, his voice raised in a series of commands to bring the laboring horses to a halt. The cessation of motion, though abrupt, would be met with a mixture of weary resignation and a faint flicker of hope for a brief, unscheduled respite from the jolting. Passengers would once again disembark, slowly and carefully, onto the roadside, which might be a dusty patch of prairie, the edge of a sparse woodland, or the rocky shoulder of a nascent mountain pass. They would stretch their cramped limbs, perhaps walk a few paces to survey the cause of the delay, and then, more often than not, find a spot to sit or lean, observing the subsequent proceedings with a detached, almost listless air. There was little they could do to assist, and experience would have taught them that impatience served no purpose other than to fray already strained nerves. The most common ailments were related to the wheels or the suspension. A wooden wheel, dried by the sun and battered by rocks, might develop a split spoke or a loose iron tire. The driver, often possessing a rudimentary knowledge of blacksmithing and carpentry, would set about effecting a temporary repair. This might involve wedging pieces of wood, tightening bolts with a heavy wrench, or wrapping a damaged section with strips of rawhide or rope. Tools were carried in a box on the coach: a heavy hammer, a cold chisel, perhaps a small saw, and an assortment of nails, bolts, and leather thongs. The repair would be carried out with a slow, methodical deliberation, often under the harsh glare of the sun, with flies buzzing persistently around the sweating brow of the working man. Passengers might offer unsolicited advice, or more commonly, simply watch in silence. Their thoughts perhaps drift into the lost time, the dwindling daylight, or the quality of the next station's offerings. A broken leather thoroughbrace was another frequent problem. These thick straps, bearing the entire weight of the coach body, were under immense and constant tension. If one snapped, The ride would become even more intolerably rough, if not impossible. Repairing a thoroughbrace was a difficult task, sometimes involving splicing the broken ends or attempting to substitute it with a heavy rope or chain if such an item was available. Occasionally, a horse might cast a shoe or develop a limp, necessitating a slower pace or an unscheduled stop to attend to the animal. Delays could also be caused by swollen creeks too dangerous to ford immediately after a heavy rain, or by the need to clear fallen trees or other obstructions from the primitive roadway. Each such delay, whether lasting half an hour or several hours, added to the overall tedium and frustration of the journey. It meant a later arrival at the next station, potentially colder food, or a more hurried departure. The lost time was a tangible subtraction from the already slow progress. Yet, these roadside annoyances were so much a part of the fabric of overland stage travel that they were accepted with a kind of stoic fatalism. Once the repair was completed, or the obstacle overcome, the passengers would be summoned back to their places. The driver would remount his box, and with the familiar crack of the whip and groan of the timbers, the journey would resume its monotonous, jarring course, leaving behind only a few disturbed patches of earth and the lingering scent of horse sweat as evidence of the temporary interruption. Part 3, The Road, Stage 2, Trials of Nature and Mechanics. Chapter 10, River Crossings, the Slowness and Unpredictability of Water. The vast undulating plains were not an unbroken expanse of dry land. They were inevitably transected by rivers and creeks, some mere trickles the stagecoach could bump across with little more than a splash and a lurch. Others, formidable bodies of water that presented significant obstacles to continued progress. The approach to a larger river was often heralded by a subtle change in the landscape, a denser growth of trees, cottonwoods, willows, perhaps sycamores, lining its banks, their foliage a welcome, if temporary, relief from the endless vistas of grass or scrub. The air might feel slightly cooler, carrying the faint, damp scent of mud and vegetation. Upon reaching the river's edge, the coach would halt. The driver and, if present, the conductor or guard would dismount to assess the situation. The width of the river, the speed of its current, the height of its banks, and the condition of any established ford or ferry were all factors to be considered. If the river was low and a known ford existed, the coach might attempt a direct crossing. This was seldom a smooth operation. The horses, often wary of entering flowing water, would need to be coaxed or urged forward. The wheels would sink into the soft riverbed, sometimes encountering submerged rocks or snags, causing the coach to lurch violently and tilt at alarming angles. Water might surge over the floorboards, soaking baggage and chilling the feet of the passengers, who would instinctively lift their legs and belongings as high as possible. The crossing would be slow, the horses straining, the driver shouting encouragement, the passengers holding their breath until, with a final, strenuous effort, the team pulled the heavy vehicle up the opposing bank, water streaming from its undercarriage. More often, however, particularly with larger rivers, or during periods of high water after rains or spring thaws, a ferry would be the only viable option. The ferry itself was often a rudimentary affair, a flat-bottomed wooden barge, perhaps guided by a rope stretched across the river, or propelled by long poles wielded by the ferryman. Its appearance was seldom reassuring. Weathered planks, often patched and leaking, its capacity seemingly inadequate for the bulk and weight of a fully laden stagecoach. The arrival of the stage at a ferry crossing often meant a period of waiting. The ferry might be on the opposite bank, requiring a signal, a shout, a gunshot, or the raising of a flag to summon it. Or it might be already engaged in transporting other wagons, livestock, or pedestrians. This enforced idleness, under the hot sun or in a biting wind, added another layer of tedium to the journey. Passengers would dismount, stretch their legs, perhaps gaze disconsolately at the slow-moving water, or engage in desultory conversation with the ferryman, a figure often as weathered and uncommunicative as his vessel. The process of loading the stagecoach onto the ferry was a slow, cautious, and often precarious operation. Ramps, if they existed, were frequently steep and unstable. The horses would be unhitched and led onto the ferry separately, or sometimes made to swim across if the distance was not too great and the current not too strong. The coach itself would then be manhandled or carefully driven under the deck of the barge, its wheels chocked to prevent movement. The balance of the ferry was a delicate matter, and the ferryman would direct the placement with a practiced eye. The crossing itself was typically slow. If propelled by poles, the ferryman would strain, his muscles bunching, his breath coming in grunts as he pushed against the river bottom. If guided by a rope, the ferry would inch its way across, the rope creaking and groaning under the tension. The sounds were of lapping water against the hull, the occasional shout of the ferryman, the nervous stamping of the horses, and the low murmur of the passengers, who watched the receding bank and the approaching one with a mixture of impatience and apprehension. The journey across the water, though often only a few hundred yards, could feel like an eternity. Once the other side was reached, the entire process was reversed. The careful disembarkation of the coach, the rehitching of the horses, the payment of the ferryman's toll, another small but unavoidable expense. Only then could the journey proper resume, leaving behind the slow brown river and the lingering smell of damp earth. The brief interruption having served primarily to emphasize the relentless, incremental nature of their westward progress. Delays at river crossings due to high water, a damaged ferry, or the absence of the ferryman could last for hours or even days, forcing passengers into an unwelcome, uncomfortable encampment on the riverbank, further eroding their schedules and their patience. Chapter 11: Anatomy of a Concord Stagecoach, the Source of Constant Affliction. To fully appreciate the daily, indeed hourly, experience of the overland traveler in 1852, one must consider in some detail the conveyance itself, the Concord stagecoach. It was not merely a box on wheels, it was a complex, if somewhat crudely engineered machine, each component of which played a role in the symphony of discomfort that characterized the journey. The body of the coach, often referred to as the shell, was a marvel of 19th century woodworking, typically constructed by skilled craftsmen in workshops in Concord, New Hampshire, from whence it derived its name. The frame was usually fashioned from seasoned white oak, chosen for its strength and resilience. The curved side panels, giving the Concord its distinctive, somewhat elegant, if bulky, silhouette, were often made from lighter, more pliable woods, like basswood or tulip poplar, steamed, and bent into shape. These panels were meticulously joined, reinforced with iron braces, and then typically painted in bright, durable colors, often a deep crimson, a rich Brewster green, or a vibrant yellow, designed to be easily recognizable from a distance and to withstand the harsh elements. The name of the stage line and its principal destinations were usually lettered on the sides in contrasting, often ornate, script. The suspension system was perhaps the most distinctive and most criticized feature of the Concord coach. Instead of the metal leaf springs that were beginning to appear on finer private carriages, the Concord relied on thoroughbraces. These consisted of multiple layers of thick, heavy leather straps, sometimes 3 or 4 inches wide and over an inch thick, slung longitudinally beneath the coach body, supporting its entire weight. The body was essentially cradled in these leather slings, which were attached to sturdy uprights or jacks on the front and rear axles, or undercarriage. The theory was that these leather straps would absorb the shocks of the rough road, providing a smoother ride than rigid metal springs, which were thought to be more prone to breaking under severe stress. In practice, while the thoroughbraces did prevent the bone-shattering direct impacts one might experience in a farm wagon, they imparted a unique and often nauseating motion, a combination of fore and aft pitching, side-to-side swaying, and a disconcerting, almost floating sensation, as if the coach body were a small boat on a choppy sea. This relentless, complex motion was a primary cause of motion sickness and general fatigue. The wheels were massive and built for endurance. The rear wheels were typically larger in diameter than the front wheels, sometimes exceeding 5 feet, to help navigate uneven terrain and provide a smoother roll over obstacles. They were constructed with heavy wooden hubs, often of elm, from which radiated 12 to 14 sturdy spokes, usually made of hickory, prized for its toughness and flexibility. The felloes, or sections forming the rim of the wheel, were also of seasoned hardwood, and the entire assembly was bound by a heavy iron tire, heated and shrunk onto the wooden rim to ensure a tight fit. These iron tires, while durable, transmitted every bump and jolt directly to the axles and, via the thoroughbraces, to the passengers. The axles themselves were of iron, and their ends, or spindles, upon which the wheels rotated, required frequent lubrication with heavy grease or tallow to prevent overheating and seizure. This task, often performed at weigh stations, involved removing the wheels, a laborious process. The interior of the coach, as previously alluded to, was designed for maximum passenger capacity rather than comfort. The 3 benches were typically covered with leather or a coarse, durable fabric, offering minimal cushioning. The side panels might be lined with similar material or, sometimes, with painted canvas. The windows were openings, usually rectangular, covered by leather or heavy canvas curtains that could be rolled up or down or buttoned into place. These provided some protection from sun, rain, and dust, but were seldom airtight and offered a very limited view. Ventilation was poor, especially when the curtains were closed against inclement weather or the ubiquitous dust. The roof was typically of canvas, stretched over wooden ribs and treated with oil or paint to provide some degree of water resistance, though leaks were common during heavy rain. Baggage was stowed in the rear boot, a large leather-covered compartment built onto the back of the coach, and and sometimes also in a front boot beneath the driver's seat. Mail sacks, often carrying government contracts that dictated the urgency of the schedule, were also stowed in these compartments, or sometimes inside the coach if space permitted. The driver sat on an exposed, elevated box seat at the front, often sharing this perch with a guard or conductor if one was carried. From this vantage point, the driver controlled the team of horses with a complex system of leather reins and a long, flexible whip. The Concord coach, therefore, was a utilitarian vehicle, a product of its time, designed for the arduous task of traversing vast distances over primitive roads. It was a testament to the ingenuity of its builders, but for those who endured its embrace for weeks on end, it was, above all, an instrument of prolonged and unmitigated discomfort. Chapter 12: Sustenance on the Trail, the Nauseating Reality of Station Food. The subject of food on the overland stage routes warrants further, if perhaps unappetizing, elaboration, for it was a constant preoccupation and a frequent source of complaint among travelers. The quality and variety of meals served at the way stations were, with few exceptions, dictated by a grim triad of factors: the availability of local ingredients, often scarce, the difficulties of preservation and transport of supplies, and a general indifference on the part of many station keepers to anything beyond the most basic provision of sustenance. Let us consider a typical midday or evening meal at a station somewhere in the vast, featureless expanse of the Nebraska or Kansas territories. After hours of being relentlessly jolted and coated in dust, the summons to table, often a crude plank affair as previously described, might be met with a flicker of hope, a yearning for something, anything, to break the monotony and satisfy the gnawing hunger. This hope was frequently and swiftly extinguished. The centerpiece of many such meals was, invariably, meat. Salt pork, preserved in brine and transported in barrels, was a ubiquitous staple. It would be sliced, sometimes thick, sometimes distressingly thin and fried, often in its own rendered fat, until it achieved a state of leathery toughness, its saltiness and aggressive salt on the palate. Bacon, similarly preserved and prepared, might offer a slight variation in texture, but little in terms of culinary delight. Occasionally, if the station was located in an area where game was plentiful, or if a recent hunt had been successful, antelope steak or bison hump might appear on the bill of fare. These exotic-sounding offerings, however, were often a disappointment. The meat, from animals that had roamed wild and lean, was frequently tough, stringy, and cooked with little finesse, perhaps hacked into uneven chunks and thrown into a skillet until charred on the outside and barely warmed within. The flavor, if distinct, was often overwhelmingly gamey. Accompanying the meat would be the inevitable beans. Dried beans, pinto, navy, or kidney, were easily transported and stored, and formed a cheap, if unexciting, source of bulk. They would be boiled for hours, sometimes with a piece of salt pork thrown in for flavor, until they reached a soft, often mushy, consistency. Sometimes they were refried, mashed and sizzled in lard, a preparation that added calories but little in the way of gustatory appeal. Potatoes, if available, were usually boiled or fried, often without being peeled, their skins adding an earthy, sometimes gritty, note. Bread was another area where disappointment frequently reigned. Cornbread, made from coarsely ground cornmeal, water, or milk, if available, and perhaps perhaps a little salt or molasses was common. It was typically dense, heavy, and prone to crumbling, often baked in a cast iron skillet over an open fire or in a crude oven, resulting in a scorched crust and a doughy interior. Biscuits, if offered, were seldom the light, flaky creations of a skilled baker. More often, they were soda biscuits, leavened with bicarbonate of soda, which could impart a distinct, slightly bitter chemical taste, or they were akin to hardtack, unleavened, incredibly hard, and designed more for longevity than for palatability. These were sometimes softened by dunking them into the ubiquitous coffee, a practice that did little to improve either. Vegetables, other than potatoes and beans, were a rarity. The challenges of transporting fresh produce over long distances without refrigeration meant that greens, or indeed any fresh fruit, were almost entirely absent from the station table. This monotonous, unbalanced diet, heavy in salted meats and starches, and deficient in vitamins, undoubtedly contributed to the general malaise and, for some, to more specific ailments like scurvy, though perhaps less so on the shorter, albeit still arduous, stage routes compared to longer sea voyages or pioneer wagon train journeys. The coffee, as mentioned, was a brew of last resort, often made from cheap, poorly roasted beans or extended with fillers. It was served scalding hot and intensely bitter. Sugar, if available, was coarse and brown. Milk was a luxury seldom seen, and if offered, was often canned or tinned, condensed milk, thick and cloyingly sweet. Water, the most basic necessity, was drawn from whatever local source was at hand, a well, a creek, or a spring. Its purity was always questionable. It might be clear and refreshing, or it might be tepid, cloudy, and carry the distinct taste of alkali, minerals, or even decaying organic matter. The cost of these uninspired repasts was another point of contention. Station keepers, operating in remote locations with high transport costs for their supplies, often charged what the market would bear, which, given the captive nature of their clientele, could be considerable. A meal that might cost a few cents in an eastern city could command $1 or more on the trail, further depleting the traveler's carefully hoarded funds. To complain was futile. The station keeper, often a hardened individual inured to the grievances of weary travelers, would likely meet any protest with a shrug or a curt reminder that there were no other options for many miles. Thus, the stagecoach passenger ate what was provided, paid the price demanded, and returned to the jolting discomfort of the coach, the taste of salt pork and bitter coffee, lingering as a persistent reminder of the culinary hardships of the overland trail. Chapter 13: Shifting Landscapes, the Slow Transition to Drier Realms. The journey westward was not only a passage through space, but also a slow, almost imperceptible transition through different ecological zones. As the stagecoach lumbered on, day after monotonous day, the character of the land began to change, subtly at first, then more noticeably. The lush, tall grasses of the eastern prairies, which in their season might have rippled like a green ocean under the wind, gradually gave way to shorter, sparser varieties. The deep, rich loam of the more humid regions was replaced by sandier, lighter-colored soils, or by hard-baked clay, cracked and barren under the relentless sun. Trees, which had initially been a common sight, forming groves along riverbanks or scattered across the rolling hills, became increasingly scarce. Cottonwoods and willows might still cling to the watercourses, their presence a welcome indicator of potential moisture. But the uplands became progressively more open, more exposed. The vast overarching sky, which had always been a dominant feature, now seemed even more immense, more empty, as the vertical relief of forests diminished. The horizon, a clean, sharp line in the clear air of the plains, might become hazy with distance, or shimmer under the heat rising from the parched earth. The quality of the dust, that constant companion, also underwent a transformation. In the more humid regions, it might have been a heavier, darker particulate, prone to settling more quickly. As the coach moved into more arid territories, the dust became finer, lighter, almost talc-like in consistency, and often of a paler, grayish or reddish hue, depending on the local geology. This finer dust was even more insidious, penetrating deeper into clothing, lungs, and the very mechanisms of the coach itself. It hung in the air longer, creating a persistent haze that muted colors and softened the edges of distant features, lending an even greater sense of desolation to the landscape. With the change in vegetation and soil came a change in the ambient temperature and humidity. The days, particularly during the summer months, grew hotter, the sun beating down with a fierce, unrelenting intensity. The thin canvas roof of the stagecoach offered little insulation, and the interior could become like an oven, the air stagnant and suffocating. The leather curtains, if closed to keep out the dust, only trapped the heat further. If opened to catch a breeze, they admitted more dust and the full glare of the sun. There was no escape. Passengers would fan themselves listlessly with hats or scraps of paper, their faces flushed, their clothing damp with perspiration that quickly dried, leaving behind a salty residue. The nights, in contrast, could become surprisingly, sometimes shockingly, cold. With less moisture in the air to retain the day's heat, and with the clearer skies of the arid regions allowing for greater radiational cooling, temperatures could plummet after sunset. The chill would seep into the coach, and passengers, still weary from the day's heat, would shiver, huddling together for warmth, pulling their thin blankets or coats tighter around themselves. The transition from the oppressive heat of midday to the biting cold of the pre-dawn hours was another of the physical stresses that wore down the resilience of the travelers. The wildlife also began to change. Those sightings were often fleeting and offered little distraction from the general tedium. The herds of bison, which had once roamed the eastern plains in vast, thundering numbers, were, by 1852, already much diminished in many areas along the main trails, though large congregations might still be encountered further afield. More common were sightings of pronghorn antelope, swift and elusive figures in the distance, or the occasional coyote, its mournful howl a characteristic sound of the prairie night. Prairie dogs, popping in and out of their communal burrows, might provide a moment's amusement, their towns sometimes stretching for miles. Jackrabbits, with their long ears and powerful hind legs, would dart from the path of the approaching coach. Rattlesnakes, a more unwelcome denizen of these drier lands, were a potential hazard, though direct encounters from within the relative safety of the coach were infrequent. The reaction of the passengers to these gradual but profound environmental changes was seldom one of awe or wonder. Their senses were dulled by fatigue. Their attention focused more on their immediate discomforts. the aching of their bodies, the grit in their eyes, the dryness of their throats, the non-emptiness of their stomachs. The shifting landscape was merely a backdrop to their ongoing ordeal. Each new vista of arid plains or distant, hazy buttes, simply another mile traversed, another small, incremental step in a journey that seemed to have no end. The vastness and emptiness of these new terrains often served only to amplify their sense of isolation and the immense, daunting scale of the continent they were so laboriously crossing. Part 4. The culmination of tedium, mountains, and the approaching end. Chapter 14. The lives of the driver and guard, unseen routines of the road. While the passengers endured their journey in a state of passive, if uncomfortable, confinement, the operation of the stagecoach depended entirely on the skill, endurance, and often unacknowledged labor of two key figures: the driver, and on many routes, the guard or conductor. Theirs was a life of relentless responsibility, exposed to the elements, and governed by the tyranny of the schedule and the unpredictable nature of the road and the animals under their charge. The stagecoach driver, often a figure of taciturn competence, was the undisputed master of his immediate domain, the high exposed box seat at the front of the coach. His workday began long before the passengers were roused from their uncomfortable slumber or summoned from the station's breakfast table. In the cold, pre-dawn darkness, he would be out with the hostlers, or often by himself at smaller stations, inspecting the team of horses that would pull the coach for the next stage of the journey. This was not a cursory glance. He would check each animal for signs of lameness, sores from ill-fitting harnesses, or any other ailment that might impair its ability to perform. He would run his hands over their legs, examine their hooves, and look into their eyes for signs of fatigue or illness. The condition of his team was paramount, for upon their strength and stamina depended his ability to maintain the schedule and ensure the safety of his passengers and cargo. The harnessing of the team, typically 4 or 6 horses arranged in pairs, was a complex task involving a bewildering array of leather straps, buckles, and metal fittings. Each piece of the harness, collars, hames, traces, breeching, reins, had to be properly adjusted to ensure it fit snugly without chafing, and that the pulling force was distributed evenly. An improperly adjusted harness could quickly lead to galled shoulders or other injuries that would render a horse useless. The driver, often with calloused, grease-stained hands, would move with a practiced, unhurried efficiency, his movements economical, his attention focused. Once the team was harnessed and hitched to the coach, the driver would take his place on the box. His tools were his reins and his whip. The reins, long strips of leather, often one for each horse or pair of horses, were his primary means of communication and control. Holding them with a firm, sensitive grip, he could guide the team, check their pace, and signal his intentions. The whip, often a long, flexible rod with a plaited leather lash, was used less for punishment than as an extension of his arm, a means of signaling, of urging a lagging horse, or of cracking loudly in the air to encourage the team or to warn other traffic, if any, of his approach. A skilled driver could use his whip with remarkable precision, flicking a fly from a lead horse's ear without touching the animal, or producing a series of sharp reports that echoed across the prairie. The driver's perch was exposed to all weathers. Under the blazing summer sun, he would be baked, his face and hands burned dark, his eyes narrowed against the glare. In winter, he faced biting winds, sleet, and snow, often with little more protection than a heavy coat, a broad brimmed hat, and perhaps a thick woolen scarf. Dust was his constant companion, coating his clothes, his face, and lining his throat. He had to remain constantly alert, his eyes scanning the road ahead for obstacles, his ears attuned to the sounds of his coach and team, ready to react instantly to any sign of trouble. A loose stone, a soft patch of ground, a sudden movement from one of the horses. He needed an intimate knowledge of the route, of the best places to ford creeks, of the locations of stations, and of the peculiarities of each stretch of road. His hours were long, often from before dawn until well after dusk, with only brief respites at stations while the team was being changed. Sleep, when he got it, was often as truncated and uncomfortable as that of his passengers. On many routes, particularly those carrying valuable mail or traversing areas perceived to be more dangerous, the driver would be accompanied by a guard or conductor. This individual often shared the box seat or might ride inside if space permitted, and the need for vigilance was less acute. The guard's primary responsibility was the safety of the mail and by extension the passengers. He was typically armed, often with a rifle or shotgun, a heavy percussion cap muzzleloader, or perhaps a newer breech-loading carbine, and one or more revolvers, such as the Colt Patterson or the later, more famous, Colt Dragoon or Navy models. These weapons were kept loaded and ready, though their actual use against hostile humans was, on most established routes by 1852, less frequent than popular imagination might suggest. More often, they were a deterrent, or used for signaling, or occasionally for hunting fresh meat if game was encountered near a station. The conductor, if the roles were combined or distinct, also had administrative duties. He would be responsible for the waybill, a document listing the passengers, their destinations, and any freight or mail being carried. He would collect fares from passengers who boarded en route, announce the names of upcoming stations, and liaise with station keepers regarding schedules and supplies. He might also assist the driver with difficult sections of road or help with minor repairs. Like the driver, his life was one of long hours, constant exposure, and a routine that was both monotonous in its daily repetition and unpredictable in its specific challenges. These men were the sinews of the stagecoach lines, their labor and expertise essential to the functioning of this vital, if arduous, mode of transport. Yet they remained largely anonymous figures, their individual stories subsumed into the larger, impersonal narrative of westward expansion. Their reward was a modest wage, and perhaps a certain stoic pride in their ability to navigate the vast, indifferent continent, day after weary day. Chapter 15. Ascent into the Highlands, the Slow Climb and Endless Descent. After weeks of traversing the seemingly endless, relatively flat or gently rolling expanse of the Great Plains and the arid basins beyond, the terrain would, with an almost imperceptible slowness at first, begin to change more dramatically. Distant, hazy blue smudges on the far western horizon, initially dismissed as clouds or optical illusions, would gradually resolve themselves to the formidable, jagged silhouettes of a major mountain range, perhaps the Rockies, or for those whose destination was central or northern California, the even more daunting barrier of the Sierra Nevada. The approach to these mountains was a slow, incremental process. The land would begin to tilt upwards, the gradients becoming steeper. The road, if it could still be dignified with that term, narrowing and becoming more tortuous. The relatively straight, if rutted tracks of the plains gave way to winding paths that clung to the sides of steepening slopes, or followed the courses of rushing mountain streams that had carved deep, V shaped valleys. The air, which had been dry and dusty, might become cooler, carrying the scent of pine, fir, and damp earth. The sounds also changed. The monotonous rumble of the coach was now punctuated by the louder roar of cascading water, the sighing of wind through coniferous forests, and the increased laboring of the horses. The ascent into a range like the Sierra Nevada was an exercise in extreme exertion, both for the animals and for the passengers. The pace, already slow, would diminish to a crawl. The team of 6 horses, their muscles straining, their flanks heaving, their breath pluming in the cooler air, would dig their hooves into the rocky, uneven surface, pulling the heavy coach upwards in a series of short, agonizing bursts. The driver, his voice a constant stream of encouragement, curses, and commands, would use his whip sparingly but effectively, conserving the animal's energy for the most challenging sections. Frequently, on the steepest grades, the passengers would be ordered to disembark and walk. This was not a request, but a necessity to lighten the load on the struggling horses and to reduce the risk of the coach tipping over or rolling backwards. For the passengers, already weary from weeks of confinement, this was another trial. The road surface was treacherous. Loose rocks, slippery pine needles, steep inclines. They would stumble along, their leg muscles burning, their lungs gasping in the thinner mountain air, their town shoes ill-suited for such terrain. They would follow in the dusty wake of the slowly advancing coach, sometimes having to push from behind on particularly difficult stretches, their hands raw, their clothing snagged by branches or thorns. The views, when they paused to catch their breath, might be spectacular. Vast panoramas of forested slopes, distant snow-capped peaks, deep, shadowed canyons. But such scenic grandeur was often lost on individuals whose primary focus was on placing one foot in front of the other without falling, and on enduring the gnawing ache in their limbs. Reaching a summit or a pass was a moment of profound, if temporary, relief. The horses would be allowed to rest, their sides heaving, their coats matted with sweat despite the cooler temperatures. Passengers would collapse onto rocks or fallen logs, grateful for the cessation of effort. But the respite was usually brief, for the descent on the other side presented its own set of challenges and dangers. Going downhill in a heavy stagecoach on a steep, winding mountain road was a precarious business. The driver had to exercise extreme caution and skill. The primary means of braking was rudimentary. Heavy iron shoes or drags that could be pressed against the rear wheels by means of a lever, creating friction. These brakes were prone to overheating, fading, or failing altogether. The driver would also rely on the skill of his team, guiding them carefully, using their natural inclination to resist the downhill pull. On very steep sections, wheels might be chained, or heavy logs dragged behind the coach to provide additional braking force. The descent was often as slow or even slower than the ascent. The coach would lurch and sway, its timbers groaning under the stress, the smell of hot iron from the brake shoes often filling the air. Passengers, back inside the coach, would be thrown from side to side, bracing themselves against the inevitable jolts and slides. The proximity to steep drop offs, often with no guardrails or protective barriers, added a psychological element of tension, though dramatic accidents, while they did occur, were perhaps less frequent than the constant grinding discomfort. The passage through the mountains, whether ascending or descending, was a slow, arduous, and nerve-wracking process, a formidable barrier that had to be overcome before the goldfields of California could be reached. It was a period of intense physical effort, of heightened anxiety, and of a profound sense of isolation amidst the wild, imposing grandeur of the high country. Each successfully navigated pass, each safely descended grade was a small victory, but one that brought little immediate joy, only the weary anticipation of the next set of challenges. Chapter 16. Another station, another night, routine becomes unbearable. The way stations encountered in the mountainous regions or in the foothills on either side offered little variation from their counterparts on the plains, save perhaps for their more picturesque, if often more isolated, locations. They were still, fundamentally, places of rudimentary shelter, questionable food, and minimal comfort, their primary purpose being the replenishment of horses and the brief, often inadequate, rest of human travelers. Imagine arriving at such a station after a grueling day of ascending steep mountain grades or navigating treacherous downhill slopes. The coach, caked with the dust of lower elevations, now mixed with the grime of mountain trails, would pull into a small clearing, perhaps beside a rushing creek, its waters cold and clear from snowmelt. The station itself might be a sturdy log cabin, its roof a split shingles or shakes, a plume of wood smoke rising from its stone or mud and stick chimney, a visual promise of warmth and food that was often only partially fulfilled. The routine would be achingly familiar. The tired horses would be unhitched, their labor for the day, or at least for that stage, concluded. A fresh team, perhaps looking slightly more robust from grazing on mountain grasses, or equally as gaunt, would be brought out. Passengers would disembark, their bodies stiff and sore from the day's exertions, whether spent walking alongside the coach or enduring its amplified jolts on the uneven mountain tracks. They would stretch, perhaps splash cold creek water on their faces and hands, a momentary shocking refreshment. Inside the station, the scene would echo countless previous stops. A rough-hewn table, benches, the smell of wood smoke, cooking fat, and stale air. The meal, if it was mealtime, might feature venison or bear meat if the station keeper was a proficient hunter, or trout from the nearby stream if he was an angler. More likely, it would be the same monotonous fare: salt pork or stringy beef, beans and cornbread or hard biscuits. The coffee would be just as black, just as bitter. The price would be just as high, if not higher, reflecting the increased difficulty of transporting supplies into these remote locations. If the stop was for the night, the sleeping arrangements would be equally familiar and uninviting. A shared common room, perhaps with a few rough bunks tiered against a wall, their straw-filled mattresses thin and lumpy, or, more likely, simply space on the wooden floor to be claimed on a first-come, first-served basis. Blankets, if provided by the station, would be coarse, probably unwashed, and offering scant protection against the chill of the mountain night, which could be penetrating even in summer. Drafts would find their way through the chinks in the log walls or under the ill fitting door. The sounds would be those of snoring, coughing, the occasional cry of a night bird or the distant howl of a wolf, and the ever present creaking of the station building as it settled in the cold. By this stage of the journey, weeks into the relentless routine of travel, the cumulative effects of fatigue, poor nutrition, and constant discomfort would be profound. Patience, already worn thin, could fray completely. Tempers might become shorter, though overt conflict was still rare, most passengers being too exhausted for sustained argument. A kind of weary apathy, a dull resignation to the endless succession of similar days and nights, would often settle over the occupants of the coach. The initial faint flicker of hope or adventure that might have propelled them at the start of the journey would, for many, have been extinguished, replaced by a grim determination to simply endure, to reach the destination, whatever it might hold. Each station, each meal, each uncomfortable night was no longer a distinct event, but merely another iteration in a seemingly endless, repeating cycle. The names of the stations, if announced at all, would blur into a meaningless sequence. The faces of the station keepers, the other passengers, even the landscape outside the dusty, curtained openings of the coach would take on a monotonous sameness. The journey had become a state of being, a continuous present of discomfort and fatigue, from which escape seemed increasingly remote. The routine, which might have offered a slender thread of predictability in the early days, had now, through its relentless, unvarying repetition, become almost unbearable, a slow grinding erosion of spirit. The only solace was the knowledge, however faint, that each completed day, each endured night, brought them incrementally, almost imperceptibly, closer to the end of this particular ordeal. Chapter 17: Rumors and Talk of Gold. In the close, often stuffy confines of the stagecoach, or during the brief, shared respites at way stations, conversation, as has been noted, was generally sparse and focused on the immediate and the mundane. However, as the journey progressed and the destination of California, with its famed gold fields, drew nearer, the topic of gold itself would inevitably, if infrequently and undramatically, surface. These were not typically animated discussions filled with breathless anticipation or wild speculation. The prevailing mood, born of weeks of shared hardship, was more often one of weariness and a deep-seated skepticism. Yet, the lure of gold, however tarnished by the realities of the journey, was the underlying reason for their presence in this uncomfortable conveyance, and so it would, from time to time, find its way to the desultory exchanges between passengers. One might overhear snippets, perhaps from a passenger who had received a letter from an acquaintance already in California, a letter carried eastward on a returning stage. Such letters, if read aloud or summarized, seldom painted a picture of easy riches. More often, they would speak of the high cost of living in the mining camps, a single egg or a withered potato costing $1, a pair of sturdy boots commanding an ounce of gold dust. They might mention the prevalence of sickness, dysentery, mountain fever, scurvy, and the lack of medical care. They might describe the back-breaking labor of digging, shoveling, and washing gravel for 12 hours a day, often for a return that barely covered expenses. The color is scarce, a letter might state laconically, or many are returning with less than they started. Occasionally, the stagecoach heading west might encounter another coach, or a small, dusty party of men on horseback or with pack mules heading east. These eastbound travelers were often a source of more direct, if equally uninspiring, information. They were the ones who had seen the elephant, as the saying went, a euphemism for having experienced the hardships and disappointments of the goldfields firsthand. Their faces were often gaunt, their clothing worn, their eyes holding a look of profound disillusionment. If questioned, their replies would be brief, often tinged with bitterness. Humbug, one might mutter, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. All lies and speculation. Another might offer a more detailed, if equally discouraging, account. For every man who strikes it rich, 100 dig for naught but calluses and despair. The real gold is in the pockets of the merchants and the saloon keepers. Such first-hand accounts, or the contents of letters from the diggings, did little to bolster the spirits of the westbound passengers. If anything, they served to temper any lingering, unrealistic expectations, replacing them with a more sober and perhaps more accurate assessment of the challenges that lay ahead, even after the current ordeal of the journey was concluded. There were, of course, persistent rumors, tales of legendary strikes, of creeks where nuggets could be picked up like pebbles, of mountains veined with solid gold. These stories circulated, passed from mouth to mouth, often growing more exaggerated with each retelling. But in the weary atmosphere of the stagecoach, they were usually met with a shrug, a skeptical grunt, or a wry comment about the human capacity for self-deception. The passengers, by this point, had endured too much reality to be easily swayed by fantasy. Their immediate concerns were more prosaic: the state of the road ahead, the quality of the next meal, the possibility of a few hours of uninterrupted horizontal sleep. The talk of gold, therefore, when it occurred, was seldom a source of excitement or renewed motivation. It was rather a muted, almost perfunctory acknowledgement of the distant, uncertain purpose that had set them on this arduous path. It was a subject approached with caution, as if too much discussion might further diminish the already faint and flickering flame of hope. For most, the gold they most fervently desired at this stage was not the metallic kind, but the simple, golden promise of an end to the dust, the jolting and the profound, soul-wearying monotony of the endless trail. The real gold for now was the prospect of arrival. Part 5. The Journey's End. Chapter 18. The Last Miles, Anticipation. After what seemed an eternity of monotonous plains, arid basins, and formidable mountain ranges, a subtle yet profound shift would begin to occur, signaling that the great overland trek was, at long last, approaching its terminus. The signs were at first indistinct, easily missed by eyes long accustomed to vast, unpopulated wilderness. Perhaps it was the sight of a more frequently traveled road, its ruts deeper and more numerous, indicating a greater volume of traffic, or the appearance of freshly cut timber, or the distant, rhythmic sound of an axe, suggesting human industry nearby. Small, recently established farms or ranches might begin to appear, Their hastily erected cabins and roughly fenced fields, a stark contrast to the untouched landscapes that had dominated the journey for so many weeks. Herds of cattle, dustier and leaner than their eastern counterparts, might be seen grazing in the distance. The air itself, while still often carrying the scent of dust, might also bear new unfamiliar odors. The wood smoke from a greater concentration of dwellings, the smell of livestock in larger numbers, or even, if approaching a coastal region, the faint, almost imperceptible tang of salt from a distant ocean. For the passengers, these were not signs that necessarily engendered excitement or joy in the conventional sense. The capacity for such emotions had, for many, been ground down by the relentless attrition of the journey. Rather, these indicators of approaching civilization were met with a kind of weary, almost disbelieving relief. The end of their immediate suffering was at last becoming a tangible possibility, not merely a distant, abstract hope. Their physical condition was, by this stage, a testament to the rigors they had endured. Faces were gaunt, etched with lines of fatigue and exposure, often covered with several weeks' growth of beard for the men, or pale and drawn for the women. Clothing, once sturdy, was now often tattered, stained with dust, sweat, and the grime of countless uncomfortable nights and days. Boots were scuffed and worn, sometimes with soles beginning to separate. A general air of profound weariness enveloped them, a lassitude that even the prospect of arrival could not entirely dispel. The conversation within the coach, if it occurred at all, might turn to more practical, immediate concerns. Where would they find lodging? What would be the cost of a proper meal, a bath, a clean set of clothes? These were the pressing needs, far outweighing, for the moment, any grand thoughts of prospecting for gold. The driver, if he was communicative, might begin to point out landmarks or announce the names of small, nascent settlements they passed through, names that, for the passengers, held no significance other than as markers of diminishing distance. The final miles often seemed the longest. Each turn in the road, each small rise crested, was scanned with a weary hope that it might reveal the destination. The jolting of the coach, the dust, the cramped conditions, these familiar torments endured for so long, now seemed almost unbearable in their final persistence. There was no sudden burst of energy, no joyful anticipation of the wonders of California. There was only a deep, bone-aching desire for the motion to stop, for the dust to settle, for the ordeal to be finally over. The gold that beckoned most strongly now was the simple, profound relief of stillness, of cleanliness, of a soft bed, and of a meal not consumed amidst the squalor of a way station. Chapter 19. Arrival, Dirt, Noise, and the First Disappointment of Aspiring Argonauts. And then it would happen, perhaps cresting a final dusty hill or rounding a bend in a well-worn track, the destination would come into view. It was seldom a grand or inspiring sight, particularly in these early years of the gold rush. Whether it was a sprawling, chaotic tent city like early Sacramento, or a smaller, equally makeshift mining camp nestled in a dusty ravine, the first impression was often one of bewildering noise, pervasive dirt, and a raw, untamed energy that was more overwhelming than inviting. The stagecoach, its paint faded and chipped, its leather thoroughbraces sagging, its entire structure coated in a thick, uniform layer of western dust, would rumble into the main thoroughfare. if such a term could be applied to the wide, rutted, and often muddy or ankle-deep dusty track that served as the settlement's principal street. This street would be lined with a haphazard collection of structures, canvas tents of all shapes and sizes, some patched and grimy, rough-hewn wooden shanties with false fronts, their unpainted lumber already warping under the California sun. Perhaps a few more substantial buildings of adobe or clapboard housing a general store, a saloon, or the office of a freighting company. The noise was a cacophony. The shouts of muleteers and teamsters urging their animals through the crowded street, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a makeshift forge, the boisterous, often drunken laughter and loud talk spilling from the canvas flaps of a saloon, the barking of countless mongrel dogs, and the general, unceasing murmur of a large, transient, and predominantly male population, all engaged in the urgent, often desperate pursuit of wealth or survival. The coach would pull up, perhaps in front of a larger tent designated as the stage office or a primitive hotel, and with a final, weary sigh of its timbers, come to a halt. The driver would throw down the reins, his long, arduous task for this particular run completed. For the passengers, this was the moment they had longed for, yet its reality was often disconcerting. They would disembark, slowly, stiffly, their legs unsteady on solid ground after so many weeks of continuous motion. They would blink in the harsh sunlight, their eyes trying to take in the chaotic scene around them. The air, far from being fresh and invigorating, was often thick with more dust. The smoke from countless cook fires, the smell of unwashed bodies, stale liquor, and primitive sanitation. Their first task was to reclaim their meager baggage, which would be unceremoniously unloaded from the boot or the roof of the coach. Then, the search for lodging. This, they would quickly discover, was both difficult to find and exorbitantly expensive. A space on the dirt floor of a crowded tent, or a share of a rough bunk in a noisy, flea-ridden dormitory, might cost more than a comfortable room in an Eastern inn. A proper bed was a luxury few could immediately afford. Food, too, was shockingly dear. The salt pork and beans of the trail stations, which had seemed so unappetizing, were now recalled with a strange sort of nostalgia when faced with the prices demanded for even the simplest fare in the mining camps. A single egg, a withered apple, a loaf of indifferently baked bread, all commanded prices that would have seemed outrageous only weeks before. This, then, was California. This was the golden land of promise. For many, the first hours and days after their arrival were not filled with the thrill of opportunity, but with a profound sense of disorientation, disillusionment, and a dawning awareness that the hardships of the journey were merely a prelude to a new set of challenges, perhaps even more daunting. The gold was not lying on the ground, waiting to be picked up. The streets were not paved with it. The reality of the mining frontier was harsh, competitive, and often brutal. The endless trail had delivered them to its end. But the true test for these aspiring Argonauts was only just beginning. The first overwhelming sensation for many was not triumph, but a deep, unsettling weariness, and the stark realization that the dream, viewed up close, bore little resemblance to the distant, shimmering illusion that had drawn them across a continent. Chapter 20, Epilogue. The endless trail continues in memory. The journey by stagecoach to the California goldfields in 1852 was more than just a physical passage across a vast and challenging landscape. It was an ordeal that stripped away illusions, tested the limits of human endurance, and left an indelible mark on those who survived it. The endless jarring motion, the pervasive dust, the monotonous diet, the cramped cohabitation, the constant fatigue, these were the shared experiences that bound the travelers together in a temporary community of discomfort. For most, the arrival in California did not herald an immediate end to hardship. The gold, if found at all, was won through back-breaking labor, often in squalid conditions, and frequently at great personal cost to health and spirit. Many would find only disappointment, their dreams of quick riches dissolving like mist in the harsh glare of the California sun. Some would perish from disease, accident, or violence. Others would eventually drift away, perhaps to try their luck elsewhere, or to return eastward, poorer but wiser, there seeing the elephant, a bitter memory. And for those who remained, whether they found fortune or merely eked out a meager existence, the memory of that overland journey would likely linger, a persistent echo in the quiet moments of their later lives. Not as a grand adventure, perhaps, but as a long, drawn-out fever dream of discomfort and tedium. The rhythmic creak of the leather thoroughbraces, the taste of dust, the sight of an endless, featureless horizon, the dull ache of compressed limbs. These sensations would be a part of them, a reminder of the immense distances, both physical and psychological, they had traversed. The endless trail, in a sense, never truly ended. It continued in the stories told, often with a kind of weary understatement, to children or grandchildren. It continued in the lingering aches of old injuries sustained on the rough roads. And perhaps, on quiet nights, when the wind sighed outside their California dwellings, it continued in their dreams, not dreams of gold, but dreams of motion, of dust, of a journey that, even in memory, seemed to have no comfortable conclusion. The primary legacy of that passage was often not wealth, but a profound, unshakable weariness, and an intimate, unforgettable acquaintance with the true, unromantic face of the American West. The journey itself, in its relentless, monotonous entirety, was the most significant, if least celebrated, discovery for many who undertook it. And the most common sentiment evoked by its recollection, even years later, might well have been a simple, overwhelming desire to close one's eyes and to finally, deeply sleep. As our story comes to a close, let the quiet linger a little longer. If you'd like more gentle journeys like this one, consider subscribing and joining us again next time. For now, rest easy and good night.